is November 5th, 2025, and Russia has issued a call for the remaining Ukrainian soldiers that have been surrounded in Pokrovsk and Kupyansk to surrender, noting that they have no chance of survival. And it doesn't seem as though the NATO alliance or Kiev is too concerned about the situation on the front lines, as they seem more concerned about Zelensky's latest photo op, not realizing the importance of some of these final Ukrainian strongholds and just how quickly Kiev's defensive lines are crumbling. So, what does all of this mean for the ongoing conflict, and how could the possibility of Tomahawks being introduced by the US change things? Well, we got into all of that and more with a special guest earlier, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Larry Johnson, a former CIA analyst and national security expert. Larry, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Oh, always a pleasure. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, it's always great to have you on the show. Now, I want to get your take on the latest here, as I know that Russia has issued a call for the remaining Ukrainian soldiers they have encircled in Pokrovsk and Kupyansk to surrender, noting that they have no chance of survival. So, will you start by telling me how you see the situation here and really what's at stake for Kiev?
Well, you live in, I believe, in Texas. So you're too young to remember Dandy Don Meredith, who was on Monday Night Football with Howard Cosell in the 70s. So we're talking over 50 years ago. I remember. And he'd always, when the game had reached a point where the other team had lost, there was no way they could come back. He'd start singing, "The party's over." The party's over. So what I'd do right now is I'd cue up Dandy Don Meredith with respect to Ukraine to sing "The party's over." They are done. This is, if we go back to 2022, in 2022, Russia was only really able to mount one major offensive against Mariupol. They took the city. And noteworthy about that was the Ukrainians were incapable of mounting a counteroffensive to rescue the forces that Russia had surrounded. 2023, the Battle of Bakhmut dominated for months until Russia finally prevailed in that. It was a very bloody affair. In 2024, it was the Battle of Avdiivka. And the Avdiivka battle, again, like Bakhmut, lasted for months, pretty bloody. This year, we got 5 or 6 battles on the same level as those other 3 underway simultaneously. Kupyansk, Mirnograd, Pokrovsk, down south in Zaporizhia, up around Kharkiv. So Russia now has got the battlefield in a situation where the Ukrainians are completely overstretched, overmatched. And even with NATO support, Russia has decided clear advantages. I did some research the other night and looked at 3 weapons classes: modern battle tanks, artillery shells, and drones. And I asked the simple question, how many modern battle tanks is NATO building compared to Russia? The answer is none. Russia built 60 to 80 last year. Now, what Poland has done is it's buying tanks from South Korea. So South Korea is reportedly going to supply 56 modern battle tanks. But that's it. But the point is, of all of NATO, of 32 countries, with the United States included, Russia's building more main battle tanks. And then when you go out and look at refurbishing older tanks, Russia's got the lead there too. Artillery shells. Again, Russia over NATO, a 3-to-1 to 4-to-1 advantage. Drones. Russia enjoys a 2-to-1 to 3-to-1 advantage. There is not one area of weapon. I mean, if we talk about hypersonic missiles, Russia's got 4 variants, actually 5 if counting one of them with the Iskander they call the poor man's hypersonic. The West doesn't have a single one, 0. So what we're witnessing is NATO has this puffed up view of itself and keeps talking tough. Yeah, we're going to give this to Ukraine and that to Ukraine. The problem for Ukraine is lack of manpower. That's the number one issue. Uh, when I was in Moscow over the last couple of weeks, I had a chance to talk to the former Prime Minister Ozerov. He was Prime Minister in Ukraine from 2010 to 2014, and he gave me an alarming statistic. He says, when I took over in 2010, he said there were 57 million Ukrainians. He says today, 20 million. 37 million have left the country. Well, I think the Ukrainian casualties are around 1.5 million, maybe a little higher, but the other bulk have left. And I told him, in somewhat joking manner, but it was true. I said, well, I live in Florida, south of Tampa. My dentist is a Ukrainian. Okay. And I had a repairman come to the house the other day to fix the water line on a refrigerator. He was from Ukraine, Kiev. So yeah, this I think his numbers are right. So without that kind of manpower, Ukraine cannot sustain forces in the field. And just to put it into perspective, the distance that this battle is being waged along a line that runs roughly from Baltimore, Maryland, down to Miami, Florida. So imagine if you got 300,000 troops to deploy. The Russians have deployed 700,000. That's still not a lot of men along a line that's 1,200 miles, 1,100 miles. Moving along that entire line to get control. That's what Russia is steadily pushing to the west, and Ukraine doesn't have an answer.
Yeah, and it's really interesting as you're watching this play out, and you've got, Russia comes out last week and they say, hey, we've got, around 10,500 Ukrainian soldiers encircled. Basically, what do you want us to do in that version of, okay, we can kill them all, they can surrender, right? Knowing the manpower shortages in Ukraine. And I look at NATO, and you're right, it's like they don't seem to have an answer. They don't seem to have oh, what do we do now? This idea that, I know that there's footage circulating of a couple Blackhawks going in near the front lines, and you watch the guys that get out, they just get eliminated within seconds. And so you look at the situation on the ground. How do you see that for NATO and for really their strategy or even lack thereof? Because it doesn't feel like they have one at this point.
No, that you nailed it. There is no strategy in the West. One of the things that, during my 12 days in Moscow and meeting with a variety of military, senior officers, as well as some war correspondent, what a difference between how the Russians talk about the West and the West talks about the Russians. In the West, it's very disparaging. It's insulting. They're weak. They're stupid. They've got bad leadership. It's always very dismissive. Whereas the Russians I talked to, and probably the most famous of them is Lieutenant General Abdi Aludinov. General Aludinov is the one who conceived of and led the raid in Suja in March of this year, and in that raid, the Russians inserted themselves into a gas pipeline that it's probably 4 feet in diameter, but you can't stand up straight and walk. They walked hunched over, carrying weapons and ammunition for 13 kilometers until they got to the point in Suja where they sprung out. So this is that General Aludinov. He's the one that conceived of that, and he led it. He didn't say, here, boys, I got this great plan for you. Go into that tunnel. Okay, General, you coming? No, not me. Are you kidding? That's too hard. No, he led it. He led from the front. And when you talk to them about the West, they speak about the U.S. military and the NATO military in respectful terms. They don't say anything degrading or insulting. They will freely admit, yeah, we're better fighters than the West. We're much better than the United States. We're much better than NATO. But they don't do it in a way that they underestimate the enemy. And that's been the problem in the West. The West is underestimating Russian capability. And you step back and just look at it objectively. Right now, as of last week, Putin announced the deployment of 2 new weapon systems, one above ground and the other underwater. The underwater one is called Poseidon. The one above ground is a cruise missile, the Bereshnik, and it has an internal nuclear reactor. A miniature nuclear reactor is what powers that missile. So in the past, when we did arms control negotiations, we'd say, "Oh, it's an intercontinental ballistic missile because it can go 5,000 miles or more," or it's an intermediate range ballistic missile because it can only go 2,000 miles. Well, how do you categorize this one? Because it's the Energizer Bunny of cruise missiles. It keeps going and going and going. So it's something new. And the West doesn't have anything comparable to that. Nothing.
Yeah, it's very, very telling when you look at the West and you go, okay, and I believe it was Lavrov that said something to the effect of, yeah, they've been very quiet since we made that announcement, right? It's not as if they're reaching out or have any major statements about it. And it's interesting because when you watch the way that the West is kind of handling things, or even the way that Kiev is handling things, you see Kiev in this position where they are refusing to acknowledge reality, right? They continue to downplay Moscow's reports. You've got claims that Zelensky visited within 20 kilometers of the front lines in Pokrovsk for a photo op, essentially. He's warning that Russia has over 170,000 troops amassed. But given Kiev's manpower shortages, their weapon shortages, how do you see this emphasis on really the propaganda war? Because it feels like that's what it comes down to at the end of the day, as if that is the important war. Let's focus on the propaganda. Let's focus on denying reality instead of looking at the situation on the ground and maybe asking some very tough questions there.
Well, you're correct. The one thing the West is doing much, much better than the Russians is the propaganda war. They have been masters of it. But there comes a moment when reality intrudes. So let's say that I put out the propaganda that said, "Hey, Rachel, all you need to do is tie 2 feather pillows to each of your arms and then go up on top of a 30-story building and flap them real fast and real hard and then jump off. You'll be fine. You'll be fine." Now, and you're too smart. You wouldn't believe that. But if you decided, "Oh, okay, yeah, that's true," and you act on it, or you know, I'm not great at math and calculating the 32 feet per second squared as you fall to the ground. It would be 1 second or 3 seconds. But somewhere in that process, you're going to come to realize my assumptions are no longer working and reality intrudes. And in that case, you hit the ground and reality confronts you with it. I was talking earlier with a correspondent in Bulgaria, and she was telling me, she said, "Look, we're constantly told, whenever you say something that's an actual fact, like, boy, the Russians have got a significant number of Ukrainian troops encircled in the Pokrovsk region. They say, "Oh, that's just Russian propaganda." And I said, we've gotten to the stage that if you say, "Hey, the sun rises in the east," that's Russian propaganda. Dogs generally have 4 legs. That's Russian propaganda. So factually, provably true, and people continue to gaslight and try to pretend that that reality doesn't exist. And look, I don't think it's a mere coincidence that in the West they've become dominated with this notion that a biological man, can claim to be a woman, and therefore they're a woman. Because it's the same sort of delusion that you build a mythical world for yourself, and you try to live in that. Well, the reality for the Ukrainians is that the Russian bullets and the Russian bombs and the Russian missiles and the Russian drones are real. And no matter what Zelensky says back in Kiev, that, "Oh, no, nothing happened here, nothing to see here," the reality is those soldiers are either going to die or they're going to be captured. There's no in between.
Yeah, and it's almost like when Kiev comes out and they go, "Oh yeah, the Russians, they shot 500 drones at us and we knocked down 490 of them. It's just that
Yeah.
those 10 that got through hit 500 targets." And you're going, uh, "Okay, well trying to keep up with their math there." But yes, it is a very dire situation for not just these Ukrainian soldiers that are encircled, but for all of those who are being sent to the front lines. And I know that when it comes to Pokrovsk in particular, this is known as a key logistics and transport hub for Kiev. And
Yes.
given the advantages that Russia has, the fact that time is on their side, manpower is on their side, weapons are on their side, and you have these crumbling defensive lines on Kiev's end, where does that leave us? And is there a concern in your mind about NATO realizing the writing on the wall and trying to find a way to escalate this?
Yeah, well, see, and that's where we get back to, the numbers I rattled off to you earlier on with respect to tanks, artillery shells, drones, fabs, the glide bombs that they have, the missiles that Russia has. You know, NATO's got nothing but propaganda. That they don't have, their warehouses are not brimming to the roof line with unused weapons. They've actually sort of uh, squandered every advantage they thought they had, and now the inventory is extremely low. The one thing that could change this and turn the conflict into a much broader and much more deadly for the West is if Trump relents and allows Tomahawk missiles to be deployed, and those missiles are actually fired into Moscow or St. Petersburg. That is the one thing I did hear frequently from both military and political leaders that I spoke with in Russia, that that would compel Russia then, primarily because they can't tell when a Tomahawk's launched, they can't tell if it's carrying a nuclear warhead or not. And because it has that capability, Russia's going to have to assume that it's a nuke, and they will take appropriate retaliatory measures, which means that this thing could really escalate and get out of hand. And I think, that's one of the reasons Putin and Trump had a conversation last week. Because prior to that, Trump was talking about, we'll send him Tomahawks. And after that conversation, Trump was like, no, we're not doing that. Because I think Vladimir Putin explained to his friend, Donald Trump, very clearly that if you do this, this is how we're going to have to react. And you are running the risk of a nuclear war. I'm not telling you you can't do it. I'm just telling you what the consequence is going to be. You decide. That's how Putin's not going to make a demand and draw a line in the sand because he knows that uh, Trump can be a petulant enough child that he would say, "Oh, you're not going to tell me what to do." But laid it out in a way that Trump would understand what the consequences were, because Trump's not a dummy on that front. So this is we're at a critical stage right now in this war. Ukraine's ability to survive is it's becoming less with each passing day. Yeah, I know they're out there talking about a stalemate. It's not a stalemate, and that Ukraine can keep this going up for another 2 or 3 years. No, they can't. And as Russia's demonstrated, just look at the pace of activity in 2024 compared to this year. A dramatic expansion. And it's not Putin that's calling the shots. It's the Russian general staff. They've developed a plan, they're implementing and executing the plan.
Yeah, it's very telling when you look at the situation on the battlefield, and you still look, and I guess this goes back to the propaganda war, right? The New York Times arguing, maybe it was, gosh, it may have been already a year now, arguing, oh well, there hasn't been that much movement on the battlefield, and then they go in and they kind of admit that, yeah, actually Russia's gaining more territory. But of course, we know that when it comes down to it, Russia is not in this for the territory. They are in this. It is a war of attrition targeting the Kiev regime as a whole and their military. And at the end of the day, this is of course a proxy war between NATO and Russia. And so when it comes down to Russia's position, I know that some people have been critical and have gotten frustrated with the Russian government because they feel like their statements against Trump or against the US are not harsh enough, that there's not enough of a, hey, we're drawing a line in the sand, we're letting you know where our red line is, that there still is kind of that way. And maybe it's just because it's Donald Trump and they feel like, kind of like you were saying, you can't just go in and tell him the way that things are going to be. You've got to go in and kind of sell him the idea a little bit. How do you view the position that Russia is in as they're clearly making progress on the battlefield, right? Getting to that point where we could in the future see the Kiev regime falling apart, but then at the same time also having to realize, okay, what comes after that? Because NATO is still a threat that you still have to deal with. And especially when looking at some of these countries in Europe, they do not seem to want to back down, whether they have the arms or not.
This is the West is treating this like it's either, a soccer match or an American football game in which you've got a set time. It's the second half, and we're now at the 89th minute. They've only got a minute left to play. Russia doesn't view it that way at all. Russia is under no time pressure. Frankly, walking around Moscow, you would not know a war was going on. Because they're not treating it as a war where they fully mobilize the population, and the population is going to be asked to make sacrifices so that the full economic might and power of Russia is brought to bear on the situation. And the reason they're not doing that is because they believe, and I think with justification, that they can handle this. They don't need to rush it. They don't need to risk taking actions that could escalate into a nuclear conflict with the United States. That their ultimate goal to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine it's moving forward, not backward. The Ukrainians have been unable to take and hold territory in their own land in Ukraine, or territories that were formerly part of Ukraine. Whereas Russia has demonstrated repeatedly over the last 3.5 years, especially starting in 2023, that they can stop Ukrainian offensives and that Russia can continue to move forward to the West, which they've been doing now. With the pace of it has accelerated. A lot of Western analysts pull this, I call it a lawyer trick. They go, oh, Russia only controls 22% of Ukraine. Well, that they're calculating all the land that's west of the Dnieper River. Russia's not going after the land west of the Dnieper River. It's not going to occupy it because Russia doesn't need more land. Vladimir Putin is not Adolf Hitler writing Mein Kampf and talking about the need for Lebensraum, this open space to the east. Russia's got 11 time zones worth of land. They don't need it. I heard that repeatedly from senior economic officials and political leaders. They go, what would we need in Europe? It's like Europe doesn't have some great natural resource that Russia doesn't have. And Russia certainly doesn't need more land, particularly with a bunch of people running around with blue and green hair. Okay. And being challenged to figure out what gender they are. So, Russia has zero intent on invading Europe, but it recognizes it has to defeat NATO ultimately, and that's what's going on. The deal that has been on the table since June 14th of 2024 by Putin to get West to accept the 5 new republics of Russia, Crimea, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Luhansk, that those are permanently part of Russia, that all NATO and Ukrainian troops are out of there, and that NATO and Ukraine end any possibility of relationship. That's what Russia wants. But they've said, hey, if you don't do that, then we're going to take Dnipropetrovsk, we're going to take Kharkiv, we're going to take Sumy, we're going to take Poltava, we're going to take Odessa, and we're going to take Kiev. And then we'll hold elections and see if the people want to be part of Russia or part of Ukraine. And there'll be internationally supervised elections. But at that point, the odds are that our country's Russia's going to continue to grow, but it's going to grow because the people voted to become part of us, not because we put a gun to their head. That's where this is headed, and there's nothing that NATO can do to stop it.
Yeah, I think that's really the reminder at the end of the day, right? NATO picked this battle, they picked this fight, and now they are in a position where they're having to live with the consequences of their actions and how far they have pushed Russia truly to the brink at this point. I know that there is certainly a lot at stake here all around, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest here. Larry Johnson, a former CIA analyst and national security expert, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you, Rachel. Always a pleasure.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment. And as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also check out Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank you all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.